Chom den den jan be yong ma cha za lo gang ge lo de den ye den da nye da nam da rab sra ve chin ye dun dun che jen ze che ni je tu gra le bon ze kong da sik be chun re ma re men dam du nge che ze ve ro so yi kun la pu je tar ze yin la tu je yong den song ru dara che ro nye mon ji long lai che cha ron ron ze chen ma re men sre dung ra nyu gu che nye chen ze ra de nam de ne ta chen sa ju tar se yuen den bu zo ja se tu bu gu chun trai chu dan chu ni jen de dang le men sen jang be yong la de zēdēn chē chē jīn rā hē sā rē chē dā lē tē mō mēn bā rāb sā rā nē kā dāng tēn chē zhōng bō tō bā yē lō chē pō bē nōng wā zā dō sā kāng kē tū jē sā rē chē tā wā tham chē nām bōng bā tēn chē chē chōng tōn bā kōng kō tam tē lō dā sā sā 자명 상나 도르제 제레제 사예님보 저반남버서 남개님보 삼바군도선 예베세진 제라 사제 오 제제 칼라 친럽진 고르제 제베 동두르제는 어포 야르베단 바군네 산제베 가유름보천 사제 오 체럽군도 시여다니래 함께섬 사계용종신 장주민별람께 까르마바이 메제데 제주게 최동주제 내로만으로와라 지진승내 쳔베시제 로소이라 끈게 빠들어와 르비도제 체럽용제 자오 라소 테네 삼바숑접 줘도 두 제바람 버살 땀네 쇼스로 낭
So please listen attentively to the explanations, having first generated the body mind.
라소 다트리마 까미슈야테 제당 대칭게 동바당 다미게 과집 주다우지 게나마 까미슈야 인
So today's topic is that of empty and without a self in the context of Mahayana Buddhism.
다제당 택바침보 생켄테 게람다 슝켄 공자체 닌지침페 끝내 송대 장집지 샘림보체 생킨 장집지 샘림보체 대 랑기 유라 제탐제기 요버레
A practitioner of Mahayana Buddhism, his or her motivation is that of great compassion for others. And it's in this context, that of great compassion for others, that the practitioner of this branch of Buddhism focuses primarily on generating the precious body mind.
That's on chip symptom but 생긴데 바르나 당분 인지 침부 끝내 홍대 세용돼 남카다냠베 샘진 타다 되네 저 코르바 통만 몇 번에
왔어?
랑라 전지 좀왜 파마당 인신 랑라 동머르체페 다 파마른 네베 랑라 동머르체킹기 다오 되네 바르마른 네베
바르마르
샘진 창망 니제 쳔베 대 창마 쇼치도 düne 니제 찹도 받지 고고요 된적 강가 찌차 코르발라 등한 용된도 델레 딴토 받지 찌차 공차선데 삼바치 그롱 당보티 고고요
A brief description of so-called great compassion would be the following. The practitioner focuses on all sentient beings in number as vast as the sky, without a single exception. Considering the fact that all sentient beings have, in various worldly existences, since time immemorial, in one or many lifetimes, treated one with kindness. Sometimes those sentient beings have been a parent, sometimes a sibling, and so on. And in those lifetimes, those individuals have treated one with great kindness, have cared for one. Then there are, of course, lifetimes where individuals have been an enemy. And then there are lifetimes when individuals have been neither a near or dear person nor an enemy. One hasn't had a specific relationship at all with them throughout many lifetimes. So individuals who belong to neither the category of near and dear ones nor the category of enemies or individuals that one has a dislike for. In terms of great compassion, as was said, it is about all sentient beings, in number as vast as the sky. So, compassion is great when it embraces all individuals of all three categories just listed equally. In order to develop as a proper practitioner of Mahayana Buddhism, this is the kind of compassion one needs to generate, where one's compassion embraces all equally, and where the practitioner's intent is to free all those sentient beings, without a single exception, from being trapped in various worldly existences.
tindeje samba sangpote yangne yangdu kamne samba sangpo tindeje yöna yang ta semchen na pinta tubate rani korve dungal le tol matum na pena pinta ayete khagbo imbare perna 마치게 마 라파니까 메킨치게 부그데 추그나는 사소나 매 추그나는 출던 탑 요마로 다 삼바상고체 데데야나로 셈체체 간차 지차 섬섬 삼나지단 데야 대인도 대내 택바신 불람라 합는 거기 버다 대인도 답변은 셈진 던제토라 라니 코르발 타르베체토 대진제 람라 합고
Now, this virtuous mindset, the one just described, is about, as was said, the intent to benefit all beings. However, if the practitioner himself hasn't gone beyond the world, it would be very difficult for the practitioner in question, the one who has not yet been able to go beyond the world, to truly benefit others in a decisive and permanent manner. So a regular practitioner who's yet not beyond the world, who hasn't developed to that point, is comparable to a mother who, for whatever reasons, have lost both her arms and who sees her only child fall into a river, being carried away by the waters of the river, and because of having lost both her arms, she's not capable of saving her child from drowning. This is an example used to describe a regular practitioner of Mahayana Buddhism, one who has not yet gone beyond the world, and his capacity in terms of truly benefiting others. So the practitioner understands this, and in order to become an able person in terms of benefiting others, he trains in the various stages of the path of Mahayana Buddhism.
대체도 딱 대부침부게 동바동 남이기네시 동보 하코에 지당 제마 데일라 감바 제에 탈 감바 존에 된인된 제토지 자고요 보세요.
되네 가르쳐줘야 좀소.
인된 제토지.
Whereas the Mahayana practitioner, who to begin with acquires knowledge of both empty and without a self, and then cultivates his definitive knowledge of empty and without a self, in consequence of which he finally accomplishes the goal of going beyond the world. The Mahayana practitioner who's gone through these three phases or stages is able to truly benefit others.
대체도 다 동보 동바 성예탕 뒤턴다도 간대지 고는 고군도 주나 가상 슈슈제 동바싱게 지미 종미도 마고제 최 탐제 시낭게 뒤에 최 탐제 너나 란주 뒤에 봉봉아 텔레 인주 인도 뒤에 봉봉아라서 봐 너나 시제 최 탐제 rang ngô dembar matupa nam to ge tue pe yul tu matupa kindechi ne oto tatum
So, in order to be able to go through these various stages, to begin with, as was said, there has to be knowledge of what, to begin with, the word empty means in the context of one's path, and here in the context of Mahayana Buddhism. As was explained yesterday in the context of Theravada Buddhism, the word empty is not a reference to a mere nothingness, nothing at all. It's a reference to that all phenomena, both inner and outer, are empty of a real reality. As was also explained yesterday, all phenomena, both inner and outer, phenomena made up of matter, and those who are or those that are immaterial rather, can be subsumed within the category of the 5 psychophysical constituents. And that then would include both oneself and all other sentient beings. So Mahayana Buddhism points to that all those objects of knowledge are empty of a real reality. And the way they are empty of a real reality, or their manner in being empty of a real reality, perhaps, is a natural one. This is their very nature. So, them being empty, all those objects of knowledge, that emptiness is a natural emptiness, and therefore not understandable, as it were, by way of thoughts and mental fabrications. Natural emptiness cannot be seen, understood, or known by way of the workings of the conceptual mind.
Ta tendre ke yet rang ngo pen tue pe yul tu ten ma tu ba chi yin na yang
Rang gi ngo ta rang sing gi tong pa so
rang jing tong ba yin ba chi yin na yang ten jin den yong la ten ne nong wa 강미도 샤르쇼버체.
So, all objects of knowledge are naturally empty of a real reality. Mahayana Buddhism further explains that since it's about being empty of a real reality, it means that a nihilistic viewpoint is not at all at hand, the mere nothingness type of idea. There is, Mahayana Buddhism explains, the process of dependent occurrence, where a number of causes and conditions, when coming together, make for the various appearances and manifestations, such as our own person, other individuals, and all other objects of knowledge, both inner and outer. So the process of dependent occurrence makes for an uninterrupted or ceaseless, perhaps, manifesting of objects of knowledge. So natural emptiness is to be understood in conjunction with the process of dependent occurrence, which makes quite clear that we're not looking at a mere nothingness. We're not adopting a nihilistic outlook as a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner.
Penna ngora jinji tongba yin shendo tender chokpa chil tenne nganjon tonga de sharde gidwa.
So there is both appearance and emptiness at the same time. There is the world of appearances as we know it, with all its objects of knowledge, both inner and outer. And all those objects of knowledge are the outcome of the process of dependent occurrence, which in and of itself is naturally empty of a real reality. So the point Mahayana Buddhism makes is that appearances or manifestations do not exclude emptiness. They rather include emptiness, because all those appearances are naturally empty of a real reality, and this is how emptiness, or the word empty here, is to be understood.
Perna what they would change the page shubina Naranso Don de la Chokses and Jikhargdua. Ta chose crank rangwala Karshavina, San Yegmarwa. That didn't have no matilla. Mig wango che ropa. Michie che. Tis some pin and zamundu, Jose no ate, Lebungo Angazol. Tang and soon no tar. Dala yeper, some tang ne. That Jose Dembare, some good. Mato Tene nang yit le takche tang da choche yan ye ge mare mi ge wang bo yan ye ge mare rare jin du yam jin na da she pa yan ke jing me thya re ye ge mar ba
If we take the example of this table, if we were to look into what this thing we call a table truly is, in terms of it being a real thing or not, we would find that the thing we call a table is a collection of parts and so on and so forth. So a thing of sorts isn't found. What is at hand is simply a collection of parts. Furthermore, when a visual perception of the table occurs, for that to happen, a few things must come together. The eye faculty, which registers the presence of the object, and then the visual perception of it. To keep it very simple, those circumstances are necessary for us to be able to give rise to the thought, there is a table. And at that point, we see the table as real, as a static thing of sorts, which remains over time, remains the same over time. That's how it appears to the worldly mindset. However, if one gives thought to the few circumstances mentioned, for the thought there is a table to happen, it should become clear that what is at hand is a group of circumstances which produce this outcome, that of the thought there is a table. It's not at all necessarily true that the table we see is as real as we think it is. In fact, Mahayana Buddhism explains that there isn't a table of sorts existing as a real single thing anywhere. What has happened is the synchronous meeting of the circumstances just listed, in addition to which there are many more circumstances that come together at the same time. And when these circumstances come together and interact, the end result is the thought, there is a table. And the conceptual mind then draws the mistaken conclusion that the table is real. If one considers the various components here, the ones that were mentioned, the so-called table, the eye faculty, the perception the visual perception of it, and so on. One will find when analyzing each of them that each of them is yet another collection of many, many segments or parts. Even the visual perception of it is nothing but a series of instances of knowledge which each registers the presence of the thing we call a table. So there isn't a real reality to be found in the context of any of the conditions that produce the thought there is a table. There is no real reality with respect to any of those circumstances, nor the object of them, in this case a table.
Sharwatang, Tandeng and Sug Mingala Jota Tonganila. Taxi, Jenna, Chipa Chick Jumper,
there is an example given here to illustrate this. Think about the reflection of the moon on the surface of the water of a lake. The reflection of the moon isn't the moon in the sky, what we see as the actual moon. It's simply a reflection of it. And this is an example given in order to illustrate that this applies, the same applies to all other objects of knowledge, such as the visual perception of a table. The table is no more a real table than the reflection of the moon in water. In fact, the table, the visual, or rather the object of the visual perception, that of a table in this instance, is just like the reflection of the moon in water.
Ngaranso thoma mebe tune joze ran yin maripal tenne tendre ge chokpa chil tenne jozi nongma di shar re nongma tinga jo daku jeb shag doga.
Now, even though this is the case, we namely regular individuals still trapped in the world. We have not yet, presumably, gone beyond the world. Because of the workings of ignorance, we have since time immemorial, throughout innumerable lifetimes, seen a real reality in the objects of knowledge we know, such as with respect to the visual perception of a table. We see a real reality in the so-called table. In fact, what is at hand is simply the synchronous meeting of many, many circumstances and conditions with this outcome, that of, as we see it, the visual perception of a table, where to us the so-called table has a real reality in that, because of the workings of our ignorance, we fail to see the process of dependent occurrence in the context of the object of knowledge in question, in this case a table. And therefore we see a real reality in the object at hand, in this case a table, rather than the fact of its natural emptiness. And this applies to all other objects of knowledge as well. Worldly individuals, or rather the mindset of a worldly individual, works in this way. So the failure, as it were, of worldly individuals is the failure of not seeing that there is no difference between the empty nature of something and that something. So in terms of objects of knowledge, all the things the mind knows, tables and so on, the list is endless. With respect to all of them, we presume that there is a reality with respect to each and every one of these objects of knowledge. Whatever we know, we presume is real. So rather than seeing that the object of knowledge that manifests, that is known, is the outcome of the process of dependent occurrence, and therefore not real, therefore naturally empty of a real reality. Rather than seeing this, we see a real reality with all things we know. So the objects themselves are seen as real. Then, in addition, there is the notion of the individual who knows all these objects as real. So both knower and known are seen as real.
Lasso, that today do the drag chutilla, then 당만저 로감 고고야래 데 감두
강기출 텐들기출
동바당 때인데 된직도 수인들라 양 델라 토마 고당 너러발라 때네 쇼르사 예 생기지 종도.
So point made is we have to get used to seeing objects of knowledge in the light of the process of dependent occurrence and naturally empty, the two being one and the same thing, as it were. That in fact there isn't a separation at all between these two aspects, that of being naturally empty and that of manifesting or appearing. And here, in terms of training oneself so that one, to some extent, to begin with, sees this, that there is no separation between a thing being naturally empty and the thing itself. In terms of getting to understand this to begin with, and later on arrive at a definitive knowledge of this fact, thus being able to cultivate that worldview, and so on and so forth. Here, in terms of the various methods of training and the various levels of development, there are 4 major mistakes that are very often made by practitioners. 4 mistaken types of knowledge, or simply 4 mistakes that happen frequently.
Then the 4 mistakes there, then
and these 4 mistakes are frequently listed in the scriptures of the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the importance of avoiding those mistakes is spoken of frequently too.
Pena nyameta urumche kadam begewe shenyi mongbo shibuchi kundone lobjong nang nyamne nang ne jema Milarepa thoma jedune mile ta cho karkar de nga cheba yisde te korang loju de kang shu ya ta tongba yik de de gamdu shorsa yila ma shorwa ji gogradas.
Now Gambopa, one of the founding fathers of the Kagyu school, who during the early period, as to him having entered the path, during that early period, he sought out and was instructed by many spiritual friends, great masters of the Kadampa tradition. He studied extensively and he practiced meditation extensively with the guidance of these masters. Now, later on, he met with Milarepa, and during their first meeting, Gambopa had told Milarepa of what he had done previously in terms of his efforts on the path to enlightenment. Milarepa listened to his account and then told him that one of the most important perspectives as to practicing the path is to make sure that one doesn't make any of 4 specific mistakes in terms of developing knowledge and realization of what reality in fact is. The first of the 4 mistakes. Well, actually, there are 4 mistakes, and each mistake has 2 perspectives. So one could perhaps say that there are thus 8 mistakes. However, the 2 perspectives of each of the 4 are the same throughout. Though the context changes with each of the 4 mistakes, evidently. So if we look at the first of the 4 mistakes in its first perspective, it's about the idea that emptiness is the hallmark of any object of knowledge. Emptiness is seen as an identification mark, as it were, of any object of knowledge. So there, empty is seen, or rather amounts to, as a notion of the thing, the object of knowledge, being empty of a real reality. Det är du, va?
Ja, det.
Tändel nangwa de tongge min du sego
det. Men dongbata den det kakare sånt.
So empty becomes, as it were, a label that's attached to something in separation of that something. Because remember, the something, the object of knowledge, is simply the outcome of the synchronous meeting of and workings of innumerable causes and conditions. So empty isn't different from the object of knowledge. It's not an identity or the personality, as it were, of the object of knowledge.
But na tanden de chalu yo. Only korla ta lobjong che tongni duje ge ripa mong chi ge chik che yong de tongba ni senge de ngarang ge goyul zam che lo yi go wa zam je ko ni ji me chong me je la pa ko nong wen ge pon de na
chi me chong me
kayang me ba chi la pa ko
lasso
Tene nongwe chue te yue dewa rawu chilko. Ten ta tenche chige lokpa chila thoma tongni la lobjong che dun ro shor na shorsa che shue te yin che bat.
Now, of course, in order to be able to at least start to relate to what the word empty means here in the context of Mahayana Buddhism, one needs to study the topic called emptiness. And to begin with, there can't be but an intellectual process whereby an intellectual understanding to begin with happens. One can't sort of jump to seeing emptiness without, as a beginner, first at least having understood what emptiness is about intellectually. So therefore, at the outset, there are various ways of developing that intellectual knowledge. One of them would be a path of logic and reasoning, where by way of logic and reasoning, it becomes clear, somehow, or to some extent, that all objects of knowledge are naturally empty of a real reality. However, in terms of that intellectual understanding, frequently it may be mistaken. The practitioner sees empty as a mere nothingness. Thus, as a nature of the thing which exists somehow apart from the thing. The thing and its nature are not the one and same thing. To the intellectual understanding of what empty means here. So there is, in terms of that understanding, a separation between the thing's emptiness and the thing, which amounts to empty and the notion of a real thing. Because if one sees a separation between the two, that's what you end up with. When being empty is seen as a nature or identity of things, which exists apart from the thing itself, then you have two things. You do not have one thing. And empty, in terms of the intellectual notion of it, becomes a mere nothingness. And the thing, a thing, with a measure of reality, in that it is a thing in its own right, is the result. So this is the first aspect, in terms of the two aspects of the four mistakes that practitioners often make.
Dendri chenhuan de la nganse kwa yang tapaji ma ho na penna chogur ma shu wechi nandra ngarang so rangin ningche gel yinandra penna tene nuan de denzen shu unde den jawang habse se ra otang le jimre singin de mendu samsam ko topate shifu jing ngarang so yor ba
Shiva nga shedan lendre
ya
ta yang chegula shukin yang de mindu sampa
진짜 뭔고 용그래
mindu sampa korang pede omare cheta sonde shikyang mena
야 체다 야 체다 로빈인가 쉬우지 요르와 탄데
다데 디니 튀기 민두시
튀기 민두데 빠나 다데 다운의 유셔대
말에
데데 튀투 그래 가르스나 동바세데 매베던 진짜라고 농아 생긴데 예베던 진짜라 고용투 데네 좀타르 흉키이나 랜데를 고왔던 뭔고 용거도가
So this mistake where the nature of something and the thing are seen as two separate things, as was said, this is a very frequent view that individuals have, whether regular people in the world who haven't entered a path, in this case to enlightenment, or people on that path, practitioners on that path to enlightenment. When hearing, not just hearing, but in the context of a thing or an object of knowledge being empty, and the object of knowledge, the separation we've just spoken about, is frequently happening. The nature of something and the something are seen as two different things in terms of an intellectual understanding of the nature of the thing and the thing. Therefore, very often, whether we're looking at regular people in the world, not concerned with a path to enlightenment, as well as practitioners on a path to enlightenment, because of this mistaken intellectual understanding, they fail to know, or rather they simply deny that there have been previous lives and there will be future lives. The principle of reincarnation isn't understood, as well as the workings of cause and effect. Here again, those workings of cause and effect and the repercussions of them are also not understood.
다트네 텔라 예쇼르던 차쇼르를 생긴데 딱 감베네 갑달라 송린도.
So here, in terms of the first perspective, we're looking at an intellectual understanding of empty in connection with the process of dependent occurrence. So that's primarily in the context of studies and contemplation as to this topic. Then there is practicing the path, which happens once the topic or the method one practices in question is understood. And the frequent mistake that may happen in that context regarding the first of the four mistakes. And if you remember, here we're looking at pinning down, as it were, the identity or the nature of empty, what that means.
Tony Tembe, Dodon Tincher, Lobjon Che, Töpache, Tödon de Sam, Yin Langarang, Quagen, Tony de, Laptum Kinchi in a young, Rangin Yamne Che Yong Tu. That Tony Tembe, Dodon, Tincher So, Rangi, Töpache. Ti turn some. Ti yin la he king ji in a young. Rangi Yamsulin you don't need te. Rangi Rikpa deed and the Gamma Shivache.
Rangi Rikpa.
Rang semin de toni in bagama shiche.
Tadi gomdu yang chi yul gitong ni la yang gom gi ora.
Ya.
Tanda sem.
Tandela
So what
rikpa sonde tas yusem ikar gogu jirwa. Tene gamju yinji tse debe sonde chana de trashor chimbare sonde.
Ti gomju shen chik tselba.
Ya.
Kande zongin.
Ta tongni singe de jinda chi injire samsam gamju tongni de yin shi injire samsam ko tokpa sharna sege yorwa. Penna
Sem le kämpa. Jul le kämpa.
ngarang ko de
Det reve. Det kan det ju inte tanda. Sem le kämpa. Jul le kämpa I tongni. Den det ko go girbe.
ya ngarang kan ko atele yindu churwa chi yore samsam chi.
Da det
Ta ngal chi
to give me.
ngal chi lab chuda. Perna ta pesha wa chi ge tongni singe keja de kanga she ge yorwa.
Re yene
Yene yang ngarang gamdu ta ngarang she wa te gamju mai pa lama da chi ge yang sa wa chi she onjure samsam ko tokpa chi ge ka ndu ndo wa.
det det kan det ikke samle tanke
Yena. Teni yin hi na yopa tar song ne song do.
Deni shen shik na kang dang shen shik.
Ta ngarang ki che de chu tongni te rang rikpe ten to cher ma she wa yin shi da wo chu ko de na ten no chu re song de.
Det den ta tongin då det kan resna rangi shen shik na tongne kova di norr gör va.
Ta pe na
Ye short sarva.
mare tande de cha gu do. Pe na ngan ra wo chi cha sha na ta nga la pe hyu ge. Nga ra wo chi ge tongni korte to za thö sam che nyong cha she ge yo de. Ya ta ngarang gam de she de ju the rang sem che ten do cher ma she che ta thong yin shi gam go nan ru char ge do.
Re yene rang sheju de norva majin pa chi ko gerva.
Ya.
Da ngarang normena yang shenta shikla tse dogen do.
Ya, che log do che wa. Ti log ro dang
So the next perspective is that of the second in the context of practicing the path. So in the context of the first, it was about primarily studies and contemplation. So let's take the example of a person who has acquired a proper intellectual understanding of empty, what that means, and who therefore is also able to teach others about emptiness. You have to keep in mind that even though the knowledge of the person is proper, is not mistaken, he has not yet come to the end of the path. There is room for other kinds of mistake. Now, this person with a proper intellectual knowledge of emptiness decides to devote himself for a period of time, perhaps, to cultivating his proper understanding or definitive knowledge of emptiness in the practice of meditation. He does so. However, here the practitioner may make the following mistake. Namely, he fails to integrate his proper intellectual knowledge of emptiness in the meditation. He sort of fails to properly use his knowledge. And rather than making it one with his mindset, his meditation becomes plagued with, as it were, the mistake of thoughts such as, oh, but there is probably more to it than this. I need to seek the advice of another master in order to get more clarification. Det rangla tid som Sava som det gick. Är det gott?
Ja, det är sånt det är men god det vill ju känna då.
Ja.
Intellectual tongni sing gamju jinda chi yo.
Now, why does this mistake happen in spite of the practitioner at this point having a proper intellectual understanding? Well, it's about the worldly mind and not being sure, having doubts and hesitations.
Intellectual
which happen because the practitioner here makes a separation between intellectual knowledge and meditative knowledge, thinking that the meditative knowledge should be different from the intellectual. Maybe the ways the knowledge work may change. However, if all intellectual knowledge were to be different from meditative knowledge, then it would mean, I presume, let me ask, teneda intellectual gigila shetugeminduga.
Yeah.
Then proper intellectual knowledge of a topic wouldn't be possible if the two are to be separated in that way. That one then tries to apply one's proper intellectual knowledge of emptiness in meditation while thinking it's probably not quite right, even though it is quite right. And it's simply a matter of cultivating that knowledge. But instead, the practitioner has some notion of that so-called meditative knowledge of emptiness should be different from my intellectual knowledge. Da chik yaga chik duga tage yusarava.
Da duga sonris da magöbe sonris danrum doa. Da tichön de shibuche gongge yot. Zaza manana.
And this mistake is quite frequent too. One needs to take great care with respect to how one approaches this sort of thing. Whether it's about intellectual knowledge or meditative knowledge, and how one understands the two.
Penna the mistake should chill down the car chagundusana. Nga gam jimkin lobjong cheju amare segidwa.
There are practitioners who take the view that I am a meditator. Meditation is my path, and intellectual knowledge is seen as inferior or not needed, and the like.
Lasso, tene, shorsa ni patella, toni lamshor sonore.
So, to sum up, with respect to the first of the four mistakes, the first perspective, the object there is that of that all things are empty to begin with, primordially, as it were, and possible mistakes as to one's intellectual understanding of that primordial emptiness. And the second perspective is then how a proper intellectual understanding may be wrongly applied in the context of a path of meditation. And now we've come to the second of the four mistakes. Tenededu?
Tedu panandere. Lamdung drebu ngol karna yerme imba hamago che.
Lamdang drebu chipushi lamdrebu segumari.
Tongbo Lamdang drebu songshadwale. Tate pana yerme imba hamago che. Drebu yen tobyu imba chitang. Lamsenge tanda drubyu indeba chik. Tene tong gela karvayina. Yilam dresam rajin chikpa imba hamago la tenne yang yeshor ti chao piyor.
Dedu ye ne shorva ye se goya kan yor.
Ye se goya te ta pana chö thamche rajin mo te ye demani ne yilam dresam te yerme imba kwat lemma tu che.
Okay. So here again there are two perspectives. And the major mistake here, the mistake itself, the second of the four, primarily concerns practicing the path to enlightenment. And here the frequent mistake made by practitioners is to view the path to enlightenment and enlightenment as two separate things. Failing to see from the very beginning that the three perspectives called basis, path, and fruition are indivisible. Basis being a reference to mind's true nature, and then the path by way of which that nature is realized, and the result, that of attaining the goal, enlightenment itself. These three aren't seen as one and the same thing. They are seen as three separate stages, as it were. So here the practitioner fails to know this, that the path is not a phase existing in separation from its result, the goal. The two, again, are indivisible. It's not the case that the path is something one trains in, and at the end of it, one leaves the path behind and then goes on to the new, that is to say, the goal. So path and goal are also not different from one another. However, the notion of that is very common, and that's the mistake here.
단디 차쇼르 때 간데 차고도 지다. 랑게 선음 지초 야점 싸바당
되네?
신이단 덴베 라메
그래?
신이단 덴베 라마키
되네?
셈살동 송주도 어때네 녜데 하 권아양
살통 송죽 ngô
띵아랑게 또자 하고하제
토츠
야
나서
데 무투 감마도 단델 트락스지 감제 고근도 삼성다
da kova koran tekareti ta di känta kikang yore
야
pa semgi samsh
야, 데 밀레 용거도가
yes
펜나 자롱 감비요레 데 감나 대왕들의 살왕그서 몽복고 메팅이 몽보텔라 데네 람로 빨리 쇼르고도 소마레 플라레베
나서 yeah. Then we have the second perspective here, which again is in the context of actual practice of the path. So there is the practitioner who, to a great extent, has engaged in good deeds and who therefore have accumulated so-called merit, which permits him to make progress on the path, and which makes for that he has encountered a spiritual guide who is authentic and who has given him instructions in terms of knowing mind's true nature, the fact that the mind is both empty and illuminating, and that these two qualities again are inseparable. And the practitioner here has been able to grasp this, to understand this. He has recognized that mind's true nature is about the indivisibility of empty and illuminating. So his understanding, in consequence of pointing out instructions, is right, is correct, and he is therefore perhaps advised to train in meditation on mind's true nature. However, while doing that, this practitioner, for whatever reason, ends up to some extent perhaps doubting his own knowledge of mind's true nature, in spite of it being correct. And therefore he starts thinking about, perhaps I should practice some other kind of meditation. He may have heard about many other methods of meditation, such as meditation on nadi, prana and bindu, meditation on so-called absolute well-being and the like, with the idea that perhaps those meditations will be more effective. However, that may not at all be the mistake. Milarepa pointed out that it does happen. That people who make this shift because of their many thoughts, some people may be more ambitious than others and therefore tend to think, I should perhaps start practicing another method than the one I am practicing, as was described. And if one puts that in the context of Nadi, Prana and Bindu, and so-called absolute well-being, that may, Milarepa explained, end up in the practitioner embarking on a path that is counterproductive. He, because of not properly understanding what is involved in Nadi, Prana and Bindu methods, develop wrong views and therefore enter a mistaken path altogether. There is the risk of this, Milarepa pointed out. Then we have the third of the three mistakes, which concerns one's view or understanding of the so-called antidote. So again you have two perspectives. The first perspective of this mistake is that the practitioner fails to see that the afflictive obscuring states that he wants to eradicate and their antidote, emptiness, the two are seen as two separate things again. The practitioner fails to understand, to know, that essentially there isn't a difference between the two. So that first mistake then, as in the previous cases, concerns the primordial perspective of the topic. Here the topic is the antidote, and the fact that primordially the antidote, emptiness, is the nature of what one tries to eradicate, the afflictive obscuring states. So again, there is no separation between what seems to be two opposites. The lam. Yeah. Then there is the path perspective, same as in the previous cases. Here, while on the path, the practitioner, as is always the case, will encounter good circumstances as well as bad circumstances, obstacles, hindrances, and the like. Now, the practitioner very often makes the mistake of seeing the two as separate in nature. Therefore, his reaction to good circumstances is one of hanging on to them, as it were, perhaps becoming attached to the good circumstances, attributing great value to the good circumstances while on the path, whereas when in difficult circumstances, his reaction is very different. He reacts with trying to push away, do away with the difficult circumstances. And those reactions point to him not seeing that there is in fact no separation between the good circumstances and the bad circumstances. Both are empty of a real reality. Then there is the fourth mistake, and it's two perspectives. Gyldig søgnam erego, søgnam gichava.
Yeah, that's gewa. Tijendo penang anzo pechubina, tam having yamnen ankinjina, tatongo, shenang nechu kanga dembara, which is a big tene sobawa, said you kanga tonga so shayo, some tong bengang le, said you yang tonga chick sharchu, that in the chick door. Tim much.
So, here again, the basic mistake is to separate what one sees as things that are separate into separate them to the point whatever one looks at is at hand. One tends to make a separation between either stages or types of meditation, whatever is at hand. If we look at a practitioner of the Buddhist Tantras, for example, in terms of meditation proceedings, as it were, the way most meditations in the Buddhist Tantras are set up, there is
Tatambo pen sabawa sendang the shenan nechu kanga tonga zojayo, Samsung Rabuchitin.
Tene nipa tongpengang le.
The said young Hongaji Charson, some gum hongtong yerme in Bahama.
There is perhaps the following in terms of a specific practitioner happening. He sits down to meditate. Now, prior to starting the meditation, his mindset is the mindset which still attributes a measure of reality to all things. He then starts the meditation, which very often starts with the so-called Svabhava mantra, which is about the practitioner recollecting the natural emptiness of each and everything. Now, this practitioner makes the mistake of seeing the emptiness segment as different from the previous segment, his everyday segment. So he's now gone from a mindset of which sees a measure of a real reality in all things, to a mindset which, as it were, applies emptiness to all things. Dandi machik yuna mandre som det gick tuka.
Ja.
Ko men mamen som gick tuka. Svabhava.
Ja.
Much like if you have a wound on the top of your hand, and then in order to remedy that, you may use an ointment, which is to heal the wound. So it's much like that. You're aware of that your everyday mindset fails to see emptiness in all things, and now as you meditate, you recollect emptiness in terms of your worldview, but much in the way you would put an ointment on a wound in order to heal the wound. Meaning here you sort of attribute a conceptual knowledge, perhaps, of emptiness onto all things, thinking all things are empty. And next, in terms of the Buddhist tantric path, it's usually the case that in the practice, the practitioner generates himself in the shape and form of a yidam and the mandala of the yidam, the world of the yidam. And there again, what appears in the mind of the practitioner is seen as separate from the emptiness he previously attempted to meditate on. So his everyday version of reality, his while recollecting emptiness segment or way of relating to reality has changed, the view has changed, and then again you have a third change as to generating oneself as the yidam and what that kind of practice involves. So the three stages are seen as separate stages.
Lasso, tangye tuso de zosung.
Mais nipa di summa sonda.
Ta nipa den dik dosarawa.
Mais shipa ginipa.
Ah. Yeba yendem suchorwa ti hyutsaipa.
Yeshor?
Yeshor de dandatere.
Shetsan lam transhor summa sonda.
Trashor de kansi lam. Tani.
Det som så att det
Ja.
Chödrak gi gone tongni gomi tupa. Pena tongni gi parchi gyab. Tene par de la ta ko tongni la mata vachene songdi shiki.
Te da je te singe de terwa. Dan di kablan dere chashur te pena nge tongban gam gu yö sam ro. Gam te ngot su du tang ten juk je du dik ma to che. Dan de tongban re sam pa.
Ti kogi mindula.
Di yin srendo.
Kande shikto.
Pen gam pe kap tala ranjin ji matu pa yimba ti ya ko ma to che gam pe kap tala tongba ni ge yin sam de ba da che.
Then you have the second perspective in the context of meditating on emptiness. Kande shikto song.
Pen tan de re to tong ni lam to hung ma to se de tang nge tong ba ni gam te tong ba ni gam tu tong ba ni yang ta ba ji gam ma to che gam kin tong ba ni yin da
which is quite simple. One cultivates thoughts of emptiness rather than insight of emptiness.
Tante mangpochi when ship chin travels zida, then rang ta chen nang the mangpo chagyot.
Now, in terms of these different possible mistakes explained by Milarepa, among other Kagya masters, it's important that every individual practitioner takes the time he or she needs to see whether I myself am making those mistakes. So the descriptions given one should apply to oneself in order to secure that one doesn't make those mistakes.
Penna de te kaju koma chog song penna marpa milla thakpo daga nanshin tusam chemba dramgon rechin kan phang chupa den chu song dai yang den je na rang ju lu shuda tu je te peke
marpa milla
da dan de kaju to top koma chog song sho tan.
Now kong nampa de nang re song yore.
Yeah, this is short and so young do mung song yor.
Now masters of the Kagya school, masters of old, examples Marpa, Milarepa, Gambopa, Dysum Khenpa, Rogan Reichen, Pamo Trungpa and others, they have all stressed the importance of making sure that one doesn't make those mistakes, that one pays attention to the possibility of having made any of those mistakes, so that one can correct oneself.
Nasu ta tuso kanga draw song kung da tene de cham yagi.
So the time for this lecture is over, so we'll end here now.
Ten one tane gam yong thakpa chi jeb go gona ten kaju kung ma chog song da yang do shimju che zye da hachang ge chen bu re sha.
Now if one wants to be able to meditate properly, it's very important to rely upon the advice and explanations and instructions given by masters of old.
Penarang sembu le topache su kora shamar continue ba kapjo ong song yore pe shiptandu tenzor zin tumna.
There are such instructions set forth by the second Shamarpa, Kache Wongpo. Therefore, it would be a good idea to read his writings where he explains about those various perspectives. It's probably the case that none of his writings have been translated to any language. So therefore, this means that those of you who have learned the Tibetan language could read those writings.
Tene karma pa wanchuk doje shakching ki triram number sumta tapotran nam ke dawe sen denzo jursha
Doje
wanchuk doje tene gubare
tene
tapotrashi nam ke song shakching dazar denzo jursha yorwa.
However, there are writings by the ninth Karmapa, Wongchuk Dorje, as well as a text on Mahamudra by Dakpo Tashi Namgyal, another master of old, also translated into English and a number of other languages, I believe, that people who haven't yet learned Tibetan could read.
Lasso sunamde tamje zagbanye tamne nyebe danam pamje jeganaje balapchuwa yesikbe chole ndo wa do war